Chapter 10, much like chapters 6 and 8, are almost entirely political, focusing on events following the war. Much of it is worth mentioning, but I'm going to tack it onto the video with chapters 6 and 8. I don't really know what I'm going to call it yet, but when it's done, I'll toss it in the description. There's quite a bit to go over. But for now, we'll go back to Geralt, Yennefer, and Ciri, who were suddenly alone in a massive castle. Ciri told them that before Emhyr left, he bid her farewell in elder speech and left with all of his men. She was already plotting her ways to escape, but it proved not to be necessary. The group chose not to question it further, and they move on. Geralt wanted to bury those who gave their lives to save Ciri's. He wanted to bury his friends. And once they did, Ciri had some loose ends that she wished to tie off. They first rode to Jealousy, the town where Bonhart slaughtered the rats. One of the villagers had buried them and arranged stones on a grave for them, a kind gesture that she wished to show gratitude for, but she had learned that the two responsible were dead as well, so their stay was quite brief, and they made for a shack in the swamps where she wished to bury an old friend. Following that, she wanted to go to the inn where the woman showed her great kindness when she was at her lowest. Geralt and Yennefer quietly allowed Ciri to lead their journey, making romantic time for each other whenever they could. Several weeks pass before Geralt is burdened by a dream. He sees Yennefer being threatened by the sorceresses of the lodge. They wanted her to meet with them, or else. The next day, to Geralt's dismay, Yennefer told him that she had to leave, and in secret, Yennefer told Ciri that soon she would call, and that she would have to come as well. Once Geralt and Ciri are alone, he decides to take Ciri to Toussaint to see the castle where he had stayed with Dandelion. They continued their journey and eventually arrive at the city. It seemed mostly deserted before Ciri notices a commotion in the town square. She guessed a festival was taking place, but Geralt had seen enough public executions to note when one is afoot. The crowd roared and make way for a carriage cutting its way toward the gallows. Geralt had hypothesized it was someone of royalty, as silks and linens lined the path for the victim to walk, as well as the attire of those waiting for the prisoner. The carriage came to a halt, and a man stepped out. Dandelion. Though somewhat unrecognizable by a calm demeanor in the face of death, they were sure it was him. He makes his way to the stand, where his crimes were read aloud to the town. I'm sure you guessed it already. His inability to be content with just one woman had once again gotten him in trouble. He stalled and argued, like you'd expect, until a distant voice pleads from a distance. Everyone in attendance stops and watches as a royal courier scurries his way to the gallows. He reads a decree from Duchess Henrietta. She was pardoning Dandelion, or Viscount Julian, from his crimes, but she does banish him from the kingdom. As the crowd began to clear, Ciri and Geralt call out to Dandelion, and they decide to make haste in leaving the city before their luck runs out. Dandelion fills in Geralt regarding the whole situation that fell out between Henrietta. She didn't do anything. Dandelion was just being himself. He avoided the question for as long as he could, but eventually he had to know. He asks Geralt what had happened to Angulami, Regis, Cahir, and Milva, and Geralt filled him in on the grim fates of their lost friends. The three travel together for quite some time before Ciri comes forward and reveals what Yennefer had told her in secret. The Lodge of Sorceresses had summoned her, and she must go. Geralt understood what it was that she had to do. They agreed that in 6 days, the four of them would meet in Rivia. Though Geralt didn't want her to go, he knew nothing he could say or do would deter her. She was as stubborn as he was. And so she took Kelpie, and she left. Ciri's first formal meeting with the Lodge was about as civil as you'd expect. She was a strong young woman who had endured a lot of hardships and trauma, and she was staring down a council of women who had been through much as well. The only difference was, the collective group of mages thought they knew what was best for the whole world, and they had no issue using a young woman to achieve their goals. Anytime Ciri saw fit to defend herself, the other mages dismisses her and tell her that if she refuses or resists, she'll be treated like a dog and beaten into submission. Also, she can one day become one of them, whether she wanted to or not. It was then they told her what her future would entail. She would be sent to Kovir, where she would meet King Thyson and his son, who she would woo and one day marry. Of course, she would have to take on an alias, and she would live her days there until one day she would become the Queen of Kovir. After lectures and monologues from different mages, she began to understand that she had no choice. But before anything, she had one request. She wished to go to Rivia and see Geralt, to make him understand and to say goodbye. The Lodge decided to leave it to a vote, and it ended up with a split, with those who knew Geralt siding to allow it, such as Kira and Triss, and the other half obviously voting against it, thinking Ciri was simply run away. Also worth mentioning, Yennefer didn't get a say as she had defected from the Lodge in Philippa and the others' eyes, so she was silenced whenever she spoke. The deciding vote actually came to Philippa, who, if you know anything about, has a reputation for being cold, calculated, and logical. So just to clarify, in case you don't understand, the whole reason why any of these mages care about Ciri is because the prophecy connected to her child. They wish to have her child be a mage much like they are, join their lodge, and manipulate the world in the same way that they do. They say it's for the world's best interest, but it's pretty transparent that it's for their own interests. But very uncharacteristically, Philippa votes in favor to allow it, and Triss, by her own request, would be joining them on their journey. Back with Dandelion and Geralt, we joined them at their arrival in Rivia. The city was filled with commerce, and despite the ending of the war, the tension between the races of elves, dwarves, and humans were reaching a boiling point. Despite the warning of a human innkeeper, they made their way to one of the dwarven districts. There, they find their way to a much less hostile tavern, where they meet some old friends, Yarp and Zigrin, and Zolt and Shive. They all get a table together, and the tavern cook prepares them a hefty amount of snails. They each take their turns drinking and sharing stories, which included the fates of their comrades, Geralt revealing the grim fates of his friends, and the dwarves with the fates of their friends, including the success in Novigrad of his gnome comrade Percival Schutenbach, and the passing of the second Dahlberg brother. They reminisced and toasted to their fallen friends, to Cahir, to Angulemi, to Regis, and to Milda. As their pleasant afternoon progresses, Geralt wished to return Sihil to Zoltan, the master-crafted sword that he had gifted him. Geralt told him he no longer needed it, as he no longer wished to be a witcher. Despite Zoltan dismissing his request, not thinking Geralt could ever give up his craft, Geralt truly insisted. dwarven customs forbid Zoltan from taking back something that he had given as a gift, so he insisted that the innkeeper take it and display it on the mantelpiece and tell stories of bravery and courage that were attached to it, a token of the adventurous Geralt of Rivia, who gave everything to save the one he loved. A few moments later, a dwarf enters the inn in a panic. He says all chaos had broken out at the streets. He said it was a massacre. Geralt huffs and puffs his frustration, grabs the hill from the mantle, and assures himself that it would be the last time. He insists that Zoltan, Yarpen, and Dandelion hide in the cellar, and he exits the inn. The scene set outside was one of horror. A disagreement between a dwarf and a human had ignited an explosion caused by pent-up frustrations that was masking fear. Humans were literally beating dwarves and other humans to death with whatever they could find. Nobody was safe. An unexplainable bloodlust had taken over the city square. Men, women, and children alike were being killed without purpose. Geralt enters the fray. He began hacking and slashing those he thought were the most dangerous to the public. But by doing so, he painted himself as a high-priority target. He begins to go on the defensive. The crowd around him swarmed and cut off his ability to move. And as such, his senses were overwhelmed, and he didn't see a young whelp approaching him with a pitchfork. And once he did, he had no room to move. Triss, Yennefer, and Ciri were nearly to Rivia, and it was getting awkward. Triss cared a great deal for Geralt and Ciri, but Yennefer had still not forgiven her for her past discrepancies with Geralt, and as such, Yennefer somewhat barraged Triss with criticisms, assuring her that they were reuniting her family and not Triss's. Triss retaliated, and it prompts Yen to say something that I would like to point out. "I feel like grabbing you by that ginger mop of hair." Triss is a redhead. The fresh chestnut hair color used in Blood of Elves may have been vague, but ginger is by every definition red hair in my book. I digress, but their furious exchange is interrupted when Rivia entered their vision, and it was burning. Being bound to each other, Ciri knew that Geralt was in trouble, so she raced ahead and left Yennefer and Triss in her dust. Triss and Yennefer entered the city. They could tell it was quite bad. Triss was quite afraid, and so Yennefer instructs her to stay out, while Yennefer goes on alone. The chaos was showing no signs of slowing. In an effort to thin out the danger, Yennefer begins using spells to push people away from her and clear the crowd so she can get through. But much like Geralt, that actually causes her more attention than she wished. All Yennefer wanted to do was reach Geralt, but a volley of stones was sent her way, and they eventually overwhelm her. She's hit hard in the face, and she fell hard to the ground. It took her some time to come back to reality, but when she does, Triss was with her. She helped Yennefer to her feet and wanted her help with a spell. The two began chanting an incantation, and another barrage of rocks came flying towards them. What happened next would put Triss in the history books. They create a furious wintry maelstrom, the likes of which one has only seen one in history, and likely could never be recreated. The absolute chaos overwhelms the brains of those who were drunk with bloodlust. When it was finally over, the killing and violence had finally stopped, the bloodlust out of everyone's systems. Most were in shock, many were in tears, appalled at the violence that they had carried out. One man wept over the body of a woman and her child that he had senselessly killed. But it was over. History would mark this day as the Massacre of Rivia. Yennefer had finally found Geralt. He was white as a sheet and stiff as a board, his head resting in Ciri's lap. Everyone stood in silence. Zoltan, Dandelion, and Yarpen emerged to see what had happened. After much magic had failed to stabilize his condition, Yennefer curled up on the cobblestone next to her lover. Ciri lashed out at Yennefer, angry that all the magic she had taught her had done nothing. Triss nearly fainted, but felt herself being stabilized by Dandelion, and Zoltan and Yarpen silently watched. A fog began to build up over the lake and moved in over the city. At first, it was light, but before long, it was too thick to see much of anything. The silence was broken by Kelpie's neigh, followed by a unicorn emerging from the fog. They all looked on in shock, except for Ciri. She, on the contrary, was hoping he would come. His horn began to glow. Ciri touched it, and her eyes clouded much like the fog. The unicorn pointed to a shadow on the lake. It was a boat. A Horax began walking towards it, and Ciri instructed Kelpie to follow him. Dandelion picked up the now unconscious Yennefer. She was light. He could have sworn that he felt Cahir helping, and he could have swore he saw Milva and Ngulimi steadying the boat as he set her inside. Yarpen and Zoltan carried Geralt, and Triss held his head, then told Ciri her boat was ready. Ciri apologized to Triss. She would not be returning to Monte Calvo. She didn't want to live in a world without Geralt and Yennefer. She then bid her friends farewell and departed into the fog, Triss being certain that she would never see her again. The four looked on as Ciri's boat eventually disappeared into the blanket of fog. Geralt opened his eyes. He was lying on his back, and Yennefer was at his side. They were below a tree, with a kaleidoscope of leaves flickering in front of the sun. Geralt asked where they were, and where Ciri had gone. She told him Ciri had gone off on her own, and where they were did not matter, because they were together, and everything else was just leaves in the wind. And so Ciri's tale to Galahad had concluded. He was in shock at how different her world was from his. A long silence fell before Galahad broke it. He worked up the courage to ask Ciri if she would ride with him to Camelot. Something had changed in her, whether it was losing the people who raised her or any other trauma that she had experienced. But she actually agreed to go with him. And so the two mounted their horses, they joined hands, and rode away from the lake and into the sunset.